Everyone laughed when 9-year-old Clara Whitfield started collecting eggshells from every kitchen in Marshall, Missouri. Nobody could understand why a little girl wanted cracked, dried shells that everyone else threw in the trash. But when the drought hit that August, the worst dry spell in 15 years, and her grandfather's corn stood tall while every neighboring field withered, the laughter stopped. In this inspiring rural American story, discover how one determined young girl used discarded eggshells to rebuild dying soil, create deep root systems that found water no one else could reach, and produce a harvest that shocked the entire county. In this documentary, you'll learn how calcium from eggshells rebuilds soil structure from the ground up, why slow-release minerals outperform fast chemical amendments in drought conditions, how sharp eggshell fragments naturally deter cutworms and soil pests, the root depth difference that separates surviving crops from thriving ones, why the most powerful farming solutions often come from what we throw away. Whether you're a homesteader, small-scale farmer, backyard gardener, or simply someone who loves underdog stories rooted in rural America, this story will stay with you. The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. Masanobu Fukuoka. In the spring of 2019, Marshall, Missouri was a town of 4,000 people surrounded by cornfields that stretched to every horizon. It sat in the heart of Saline County, where the soil had once been so rich that settlers called it black gold. But by 2019, that gold was running thin. Earl Whitfield had farmed the same 40 acres east of town for 52 years. He was 74 years old, lean as a fence post, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same oak as his front porch. His wife, Margaret, had been saving his bacon and eggs every morning for 51 of those years, and she had thrown away roughly 18,000 eggshells without ever thinking twice about them. Their granddaughter, Clara, came to live with them in March. Her mother, Earl and Margaret's only daughter, had taken a job in Kansas City as a nurse, working double shifts to save for Clara's future. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, 6 months, maybe a year. Just until things stabilized. Clara was small for 9. She had her grandmother's freckles and her grandfather's stubborn jaw. She read constantly library books, old almanacs, the backs of seed packets. She asked questions that made Earl pause mid-chew at the dinner table. She followed him everywhere he went on the farm, watching, listening, absorbing. In April, Earl took her to the eastern field to help him plant corn. It was ritual. He had done the same with his daughter 30 years before. The planter dropped seeds in straight rows, the soil closed over them, and within a week the first green shoots would push through. But the eastern field was struggling, had been for years. The corn grew shorter there, the ears were smaller. The stalks turned yellow too early, as if the plants were giving up before summer even arrived. Earl had spent thousands on soil amendments, lime, gypsum, micronutrient blends. Each spring he hoped, each fall he was disappointed. Clara noticed immediately. She walked the rows while Earl worked the planter, kneeling to touch the soil, crumbling it in her fingers. "Grandpa," she said, "this dirt feels different, Top." "It is different," Earl said. "It's tired, old, used up. Can dirt get tired?" "Everything gets tired, Clara, even dirt." That night, Clara went to the Marshall Public Library. It was a small brick building with a children's section in the back and a farming shelf that hadn't been updated since the 90s. She found a book called Soil Chemistry for the Small Farmer. It was yellowed and smelled like mildew. She checked it out for the maximum 3 weeks. She read it cover to cover, twice. She learned about pH and cation exchange capacity and the role of calcium in building soil structure. She learned that calcium wasn't just a nutrient plants ate. It was the glue that held soil particles together. creating the crumb structure that allowed roots to breathe and water to move. She learned that when calcium leached out of soil, the structure collapsed, the particles packed together, the pores closed. Water ran off instead of soaking in. Roots hit walls instead of spreading freely, and no amount of nitrogen or phosphorus could fix what calcium had broken. She also learned that eggshells were approximately 95% calcium carbonate, that they broke down slowly, over months, not days, releasing calcium gradually into the soil, that unlike fast-dissolving lime, they didn't wash away in the first rain, that their sharp edges deterred cutworms and slugs, that their porous structure improved aeration and water retention. Clara had an idea. The next morning, she asked Margaret to start saving eggshells, not just from their kitchen, from everywhere. The diner, the church, the neighbors. She wanted them rinsed, dried, and crushed into rough pieces no bigger than a pea. Margaret looked at her granddaughter, then at the book open on the kitchen table, then back at Clara. "Eggshells," she said. "Eggshells," Clara confirmed. Margaret didn't laugh. She had been married to Earl for 51 years. She had learned that sometimes the strangest ideas were worth trying. "All right," she said. "I'll talk to Doris at the diner." Doris Henley had owned the Main Street Diner for 30 years. She served breakfast to every farmer in the county and knew more about local gossip than the newspaper. When Margaret asked her to save eggshells for Clara, Doris didn't ask why. She just nodded and set aside a plastic bucket behind the counter. By the end of the first week, Clara had 3 gallons of crushed shells. By the end of the second week, she had 8. The church ladies, after some initial confusion, began bringing their shells to Sunday service in paper bags. The neighbors, when they heard what she was doing, mostly laughed, but they saved their shells anyway. It was a small town. People helped each other, even when they thought you were crazy. Clara had a system. Every morning after breakfast, she filled her battered metal bucket with crushed shells and walked the half-mile to the eastern field. She had drawn a map on graph paper. Every row, every plant, marked with tiny X's. She would kneel beside each young corn shoot, dig a small hole with her fingers about 4 inches from the stem, drop in a handful of shells, and cover them with soil. It took her 3 hours to do 1 row. There were 64 rows in the eastern field. She worked every morning, every evening, every Saturday. She didn't rush. She didn't skip plants. She talked to them sometimes, though she would never admit that to anyone. The neighbors driving past on Route 65 would slow their trucks and stare. Some laughed. A few shouted, "Hey, kid, you planting breakfast out there? Your grandpa know you're burying garbage in his field? Eggshells ain't fertilizer, sweetheart. That's not how farming works." Clara never answered. She just kept walking, kept kneeling, kept burying those shells. Earl watched her from the barn, where he was repairing a tractor hitch. He didn't intervene. He had tried everything else. The Agricultural Extension Office had run out of suggestions. The soil tests kept coming back the same. Calcium depleted, pH too low, structure collapsing. If his granddaughter wanted to bury eggshells, he would let her bury eggshells. He had been farming long enough to know that sometimes you had to try the thing that didn't make sense, that the book knowledge and the university studies and the commercial products didn't always match the reality of a particular field in a particular year. That farming was as much art as science, as much faith as calculation. But he didn't believe it would work. Not really. He had spent too many years hoping and being disappointed. He watched Clara work with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride in her determination, sorrow that she would probably learn the same hard lesson he had. That sometimes, no matter what you do, the soil is just used up. By early June, Clara had buried shells beside every corn plant in the eastern field. Over 12,000 plants. Her hands were calloused. Her knees were permanently grass-stained. She had filled 3 notebooks with observations: plant height, leaf color, soil moisture, weather conditions. The corn in the western field, the half Earl had treated with commercial lime, was already 6 inches taller. It was a deeper green, the leaves broader and more vigorous. The eastern field, Clara's field, looked fine. Not impressive, just fine. The laughter from the neighbors intensified at the grain elevator, where farmers gathered to commiserate and compare notes. The jokes were relentless. "Earl's gone organic," one farmer said, slapping the counter. "Organic and crazy." "Nah," another replied. "He's just letting the kid play farmer. Keeps her out of trouble." "How many eggs you think she's buried? Must be a whole chicken farm by now." Earl heard the jokes. He didn't repeat them to Clara. He didn't need to. She knew. She had heard the shouts from the trucks. She had seen the looks. But she had also read her library book 3 times, and she understood something the laughing farmers didn't. The race isn't won in June, it's won in August. Calcium from commercial lime dissolves quickly. It changes the top layer of soil fast, sometimes too fast. A heavy rain can wash it below the root zone before plants can use it. The pH spike can shock soil microorganisms, the tiny creatures that actually make nutrients available to plants. Eggshells dissolve slowly, over months. They stay where you put them. They release calcium gradually, steadily, right beside the roots that need it. They don't shock the soil. They don't wash away. They just keep working, day after day, invisible and patient. Clara had done the math. 1 eggshell contains roughly 800 milligrams of calcium. A handful of crushed shells, about 15 eggshells, contains roughly 12 grams. Buried beside a corn plant, that calcium would become available over the entire growing season, not in a rush, not in a flood, in a steady stream that the plant could absorb as it needed. She also knew about the roots. Corn roots can grow 6 feet deep in good soil, but in compacted, calcium-depleted soil, they often stop at 18 inches. They hit a hard pan, a layer where the soil particles have packed together so tightly that roots cannot penetrate. The plant is stuck, dependent on whatever moisture and nutrients exist in that shallow zone. Eggshells don't just add calcium. Their sharp, irregular fragments create tiny channels in the soil, microscopic pathways that water can follow, roots can explore, air can reach. They improve structure from the inside out, slowly, steadily, in ways that chemical amendments cannot replicate. Clara couldn't see this happening. No one could. It was happening underground, in the dark, in the silence of the soil. But she believed it was happening. She had read the book. She had done the math. She had faith. By mid-July, the corn in both fields was knee-high, then waist-high, then shoulder-high. The western field remained visibly taller, visibly greener. The eastern field looked healthy but unremarkable. The difference was subtle. A few inches in height, a slightly lighter shade of green, a marginally smaller leaf span. Earl soil tested both fields. The western field, treated with lime, showed a pH of 5.9 in the top 2 inches of soil. Below that, it was still 5.4, unchanged. The lime had worked on the surface and washed away. The eastern field showed a pH of 6.2, not at the surface, but at 6 inches deep, right where the roots were. The calcium from the eggshells had migrated downward slowly, steadily, exactly where it was needed. Earl didn't tell Clara the results right away. He wanted to be sure. He dug carefully around a plant in each field, exposing the root systems without damaging them. The western plant had roots reaching 18 inches deep, spreading in a tight cone. They were white and healthy, but clearly stopped at a hard pan layer. The eastern plant had roots reaching 26 inches, spreading in a wide, fibrous web, exploring deeper than Earl had seen in that field in a decade. He sat back on his heels in the dirt and looked across the field to where Clara was walking the rows, checking her map, making sure she hadn't missed any plants. She was so small against the green corn, so determined, so patient. He felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, exactly. Something older than hope. Something like recognition. The recognition that his granddaughter understood something he had forgotten, that the best things grow slowly, that persistence beats intensity, that the smallest actions repeated daily can move mountains. He didn't tell her about the roots. He just watched her work, and he began to believe. August arrived with a vengeance. A high-pressure system parked itself over the Midwest and refused to move. The temperatures climbed into the high 90s. The humidity wrapped around the county like a wet wool blanket. For 23 days, no rain fell in Saline County. The corn was in its most critical phase, pollination and grain fill. The silks had emerged, catching pollen from the tassels, beginning the process that would determine how many kernels filled each ear. This was the moment when water stress could destroy a crop, when a few days without moisture could mean the difference between a full harvest and a failed field. Earl didn't have irrigation. He had a well for the house and barn, but nothing that could water 40 acres. He watched the sky every morning, every evening, hoping for clouds that never came. He had seen droughts before. He knew what they could do. The western half of his field began showing stress in the second week of August. The leaves curled inward along their length, a defensive mechanism to reduce surface area and conserve moisture. The stalks lost their deep green, fading to yellow at the tips. The ears, still developing, began to abort kernels at the tips, the plant sacrificing the future to survive the present. Earl walked that field with a soil probe, pushing it into the ground at regular intervals. At 12 inches, the soil was dry. At 18 inches, it was dust. The roots of his corn plants had nowhere to go, nothing to drink. They were trapped in the shallow zone where the lime had worked and the water had evaporated. Then he walked the eastern field. The leaves were broader, flatter, better oriented to catch what morning dew there was. The stalks remained green, strong, upright, and when he pushed his soil probe into the ground, it kept going. 18 inches, 20 inches, 24 inches. At 26 inches, he finally found moisture. Not much, a faint dampness in the soil, but enough. He dug around one of Clara's plants, careful not to damage the roots. They were everywhere, thick, white, fibrous, reaching deep into the soil profile. They had found water that the shallow-rooted western plants could not touch. They had built a network that sustained the plant even as the world above ground burned. Earl stood in that field with sweat running down his back and tears running down his face. He was 74 years old. He had farmed through droughts and floods and markets that paid less than the cost of production. He had buried his father in this soil, married Margaret in the church down the road, raised a daughter who had moved to the city to build a better life. And now his 9-year-old granddaughter had taught him something that 52 years of farming experience and thousands of dollars of commercial products had not. That the soil was alive, that it could heal, that the smallest, most overlooked things, the things we throw away every morning with our breakfast, could rebuild what industrial agriculture had broken. He didn't tell Clara about the tears. He just walked back to the house, found Margaret in the kitchen, and held her for a long time without saying anything. The neighbors noticed. They drove past slowly now, studying the field, trying to understand what they were seeing. The eastern half stood tall and green. The western half was visibly shorter, visibly stressed, visibly struggling. Same seed, same rain, or lack of it, same farmer. The only difference was what had been put in the ground beside each plant. Doris from the diner called Earl one evening, her voice quiet and serious. "Earl, I got to ask, what did you do to that east field?" Earl told her. He told her about the eggshells, about the calcium, about the roots, about a 9-year-old girl who had read a library book and believed it. Doris was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm saving shells from now on, all of them. And I'm telling every customer who comes in." By late August, the difference was visible from Route 65. Cars slowed, tractors stopped. Farmers stood at the fence line and stared. The eastern field was an island of green in a sea of yellowing stress. And then, on August 28th, the rains finally came. Not much, 2 inches over 3 days, but enough. Enough to carry the crop through to maturity. Enough to fill the kernels that had survived the drought. Enough to make the difference between a failed field and a record harvest. Harvest came in late October, after the first hard frost had dried the corn to proper moisture. Earl hired a combine and operator. The same man who harvested half the county, a man named Frank who had been running combines since he was 16 and had seen every kind of crop failure and success. Frank didn't know which half was which. He just drove the rows, measuring yield as he went, his eyes on the monitor, his hands steady on the wheel. The western half, the half treated with commercial lime, averaged 134 bushels per acre, better than the previous year. Respectable, given the drought. Enough to pay the bills barely, with nothing left over. The eastern half, Clara's half, averaged 187 bushels per acre, 53 bushels more per acre. On 20 acres, that was over 1,000 additional bushels. At the market price that fall, $3.85 per bushel. That was nearly $4,000 of extra income from half a field. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. The test weight, a measure of grain quality and density, was higher on the eastern corn, 58 pounds per bushel compared to 54. The kernels were plumper, denser, more valuable per bushel. The stalks had stayed strong through the drought, meaning less lodging, less loss, less time spent picking up fallen plants. The moisture content was lower too. The eastern corn dried faster in the field. Saving Earl money on drying costs at the elevator, Frank pulled up beside Earl when he was done, killed the engine, and climbed down from the cab. He pulled off his cap and wiped his forehead with a red bandana. He was 62 years old, and he had never seen what he had just seen. "Earl," he said, his voice low and serious, "I've been farming this county for 46 years. I ain't never seen a half-field difference like that. Not with the same seed, not with the same weather. What in God's name did you do?" Earl looked across the field to where Clara was walking the rows one last time, her bucket empty now, checking for any ears the combine might have missed. She was so small against the stubble, so determined, so completely unaware that she had just changed everything. "Eggshells," Earl said. "My granddaughter buried eggshells." Frank stared at him, then he laughed, not a mocking laugh, but the laugh of a man who has just seen something he cannot explain, something that breaks the rules he thought he knew. "Eggshells," he repeated. "Well, I'll be." Word spread faster than a summer storm. The county extension agent came out to test the soil himself. pH, calcium levels, organic matter, the full suite. He confirmed what Earl's simple tests had shown. The eastern field had been transformed. Not just treated, transformed. The structure had improved. The biology had returned. The soil was alive again. The local newspaper sent a photographer. A regional farming magazine called for an interview. A state agricultural newsletter ran a feature. Earl did the interviews because Clara wouldn't. She didn't want to be famous. She just wanted to know if they could do it again next year. Bigger, more shells, more fields. Earl looked at his granddaughter, still small, still freckled, still with dirt under her fingernails. And he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not pride, exactly. Something deeper, something like hope. The hope that the land could heal, that the old ways and the new knowledge could find common ground, that the next generation might not inherit a broken world, but one that could still be mended. He said yes. Of course he said yes. The next spring, half the county was saving eggshells. Doris at the diner had a collection system now. 3 buckets behind the counter, labeled and monitored. The church ladies brought their shells in canvas bags. Neighbors who had once laughed now quietly asked if they could tour the field, if they could learn the method, if they could contribute their shells. Clara was 10 now. She had a new notebook, bigger than the last one. She had read 5 more books on soil science. She wanted to study agriculture in college, maybe soil microbiology. She still walked the fields every morning, bucket in hand, burying shells in the dirt with the patience of someone who understood that the best things cannot be rushed. And every year, when the harvest came in, the neighbors stopped laughing. They just watched and wondered, and slowly began to understand that the smallest things, the things we throw away, the things we overlook, the patience of a child with a bucket, can change everything. The science of what Clara discovered is both simple and profound. Calcium is the backbone of healthy soil. It binds soil particles together into aggregates, small clumps that create pore spaces between them. These pores allow water to infiltrate, roots to penetrate, and air to reach the microorganisms that cycle nutrients and make them available to plants. When calcium is depleted, this structure collapses. The soil compacts, water runs off instead of soaking in, roots hit walls. The soil becomes dead dirt, chemically present but biologically inactive. Commercial lime, calcium carbonate ground fine and pelletized, is the standard solution. It works, but it works fast. Too fast sometimes. The fine particles dissolve quickly, spiking pH in the top layer of soil. Heavy rain moves them downward before plants can use them. The rapid pH change can shock soil biology, killing the very microorganisms that make calcium available. Eggshells are also calcium carbonate, but their particle size is roughly 10 times larger than commercial lime powder. They dissolve 10 times slower. They stay where you put them. They release calcium gradually, steadily, over months rather than days. They don't spike pH, they nudge it upward gently, giving soil biology time to adapt and thrive. The sharp edges of crushed egg shells deter soil-dwelling pests. Cutworms, the larvae of night-flying moths, slice through young corn stems at ground level, killing the plant. They avoid areas with sharp, abrasive materials. Eggshell fragments create a barrier that cutworms will not cross. The porous structure of eggshell fragments improves soil aeration and water retention. Each fragment is a tiny reservoir, holding moisture that would otherwise drain away. Each fragment creates a microchannel that water can follow, roots can explore, air can reach, and perhaps most importantly, eggshells are free. Americans discard approximately 150,000 tons of eggshells every year. Shells that contain one of the most useful minerals for soil health. Shells that break down slowly and steadily and precisely where we need them. Shells that represent a resource we throw away without thinking. While we spend billions on chemical amendments that often fail to solve the problems they target. Clara didn't know all of this when she started. She knew what she had read in a library book. She had done the math on notebook paper. She had faith in slow processes and persistent effort. She had the patience that adults often lose, the willingness to work every day on something that might not show results for months. That patience was the real innovation. Not the eggshells themselves, but the willingness to use them. To trust in slow processes, to believe that small actions repeated daily could transform a field that commercial agriculture had given up on. The story of Clara Whitfield is not really about eggshells. It is about what we throw away. Every eggshell cracked into a garbage disposal. Every coffee ground swept into a trash can. Every leaf raked into a bag and hauled to the curb. These are resources, nutrients. building blocks of soil health that we discard while we spend money on chemical substitutes that often fail to replicate what nature provides for free. It is about what we overlook. A 9-year-old with a library book and a bucket saw something that experienced farmers with advanced degrees and expensive equipment had missed. Not because she was smarter, but because she was looking with fresh eyes. Because she had not yet learned that some things are impossible. Because she had the humility to read an old book and the courage to act on what it said. It is about patience. In a world obsessed with quick fixes and instant results, eggshells teach the opposite lesson. They work slowly. They work quietly. They work over months, not minutes. And in a drought, in a test, in the moment when everything is on the line, that slow, steady work pays off in ways that fast solutions cannot match. It is about the soil beneath our feet, the living, breathing, complex ecosystem that feeds us all, that we treat like dirt, that we poison and compact and ignore until it fails us. Clara's eggshells didn't just add calcium. They built structure. They created habitat. They invited life back into ground that had been slowly dying for a decade, and it is about the generations. About what we pass down. Earl Whitfield had passed down his farm, his work ethic, his stubbornness. But Clara passed something back, a reminder that innovation doesn't require new technology or expensive inputs. Sometimes it requires only the willingness to see value in what others discard, to trust in processes too slow for modern attention spans, to believe that the smallest hands can move the earth. Earl Whitfield still farms that land in Marshall, Missouri. He is 76 now, slower than he used to be, but still out there every morning. The Eastern 40 is his best producing field. He doesn't use commercial lime there anymore. He uses eggshells. Thousands of them, saved by Margaret, by Doris at the diner, by the church ladies, by neighbors who once laughed and now quietly compete to see who can contribute the most. Clara is 11 now. She still lives with her grandparents, though her mother visits every weekend. She wants to study soil science in college, then come back to Saline County and farm. She has plans for expanding the Eggshell program, community collection points, educational workshops for kids, a small business model that turns waste into wealth. She still walks the fields every spring, bucket in hand, burying shells in the dirt. She still keeps her notebooks, now filled with 5 years of data. She still talks to the plants sometimes, though she would still never admit it. And every year, when the harvest comes in, the neighbors stop laughing. They just watch and wonder and begin to understand that the smallest things, the things we throw away, the things we overlook, the patience of a child with a bucket, can change everything. The fields around Marshall still stretch to every horizon. The corn still grows tall in summer and turns gold in fall. The grain elevator still fills with harvest every October, and farmers still gather to compare notes and tell stories. But something has shifted. In the kitchens of Saline County, eggshells are no longer garbage. They are saved, dried, crushed, collected. In the schools, teachers use Clara's story to teach about soil science and sustainability. In the fields, more farmers are experimenting with slow amendments, with biological approaches, with the patience that industrial agriculture has trained out of us. It is a small shift, a local one, the kind of change that doesn't make headlines or transform markets, but it is real. It is growing, and it started with a 9-year-old girl who read a library book, believed what it said, and refused to stop burying eggshells even when everyone laughed. That is the power of persistence. That is the power of faith in slow processes. That is the power of seeing value where others see waste. The next time you crack an egg, remember Clara Whitfield. Remember what we throw away. Remember that the most powerful solutions are often the simplest ones. And remember that sometimes the only thing standing between a dying field and a record harvest is the willingness to kneel in the dirt day after day and put back what nature gave us in the first place. The harvest will come, not on our schedule, not in the way we expect, but it will come. For those who wait, for those who work, for those who believe that even the smallest hands can change the earth. The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. Masanobu Fukuoka Clara Whitfield didn't set out to cultivate perfection. She just wanted to help her grandfather's corn grow. But in the walking, the kneeling, the burying of thousands of shells, in the patience and persistence of a child who believed in something the world told her was foolish, she cultivated something far more valuable than a good harvest. She cultivated proof that the overlooked can be powerful, that the discarded can be transformative, that the smallest hands, moving with purpose, can change the earth beneath them. And somewhere in Marshall, Missouri, on a spring morning just after sunrise, a small girl with a battered metal bucket is still walking the rows, still kneeling in the dirt, still burying the broken things that the world threw away, and still proving, one eggshell at a time, that patience is the most powerful force in agriculture and in life.